Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something that sounds like a dream but was secretly a beautifully wrapped nightmare. Life as a wealthy aristocrat in 1780s France. Not the fairy tale version with glittering chandeliers and endless cake. Not the powdered romance that Hollywood loves to sell you. I mean the real thing. The corsets that crushed your ribs, the wigs that quietly housed actual wildlife, and the palace so dazzling on the outside and so foul on the inside that people simply relieve themselves in the hallways. Before we sink into all of that, I want to say a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas are honestly what keep this whole thing alive, and I read every single one, so please keep them coming. If you enjoy these slow, late-night journeys through history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure at all. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. By the way, the channel is now on Spotify as well, so if you would rather drift off with just your ears and no screen, the link is waiting for you down in the description. And if you would like the extended, completely ad-free versions of these episodes, those live in the membership, now dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be rich in old France? Was being noble as fabulous as it looked, or was it mostly starving inside a gold-plated cage? Did anyone at Versailles ever truly bathe, or did they just keep layering perfume on top of the problem? Could you survive an entire morning simply getting dressed while a dozen strangers watched? Would you keep your composure wearing a wig the height of a small child, or would you tip sideways trying to squeeze through a doorway? And could you smile serenely through a royal dinner eaten in front of a live audience while quietly going completely bankrupt? Well, you're about to find out. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1785, somewhere inside a freezing palace bedroom that cost more than an entire village. You're extraordinarily wealthy, mildly poisoned by your own makeup, and already running late for a formal ceremony about putting on your shirt. Good luck. Let's begin where every day begins, with waking up, except your morning has absolutely nothing to do with rest. You are a wealthy noble in 1780s France, which means you do not simply open your eyes, roll over, and decide the world can wait 10 more minutes. You wake on a schedule dictated by ceremony, in a bedchamber roughly the size of a modern parking garage, beneath a canopy of heavy silk that has never once, in its long, luxurious life, been washed. The room is freezing because palaces were built to impress visitors, not to keep a human being warm, and the fire across the vast floor is bravely heating a space it has no realistic hope of heating. And here is the genuinely exhausting part. The moment you stir, people appear. Servants, courtiers, and a few faces you do not recognize file in to watch you perform the sacred and delicate art of sitting up. Privacy, it turns out, is a peasant luxury. You're rich now, which means even your morning grogginess is a spectator sport. Let's linger on that cold for a moment, because it is worse than you imagine. The great rooms of a grand house held onto winter the way a cellar does, stone and marble drinking in the chill and giving nothing back. Your enormous windows are beautiful and about as insulating as a sheet of paper, so you lie there, tucked under blankets that cost a fortune, watching your own breath drift toward a ceiling painted with gods and cherubs who are frankly not helping. Somewhere in the room, a servant has already crept in to coax the fire back to life, moving quietly so as not to wake you, though of course you are awake, because who could sleep through the soft parade of people gathering to observe you? And they really do gather. In the grandest households, the moment of rising was a small ceremony in its own right, an event people competed to attend. To be present when a great noble woke was a mark of your own importance, which is a genuinely strange thing to compete over. Imagine your proudest achievement being that you were allowed to stand in a cold room and watch someone else blink themselves conscious. Yet that was the currency here. Proximity was power. The closer you were permitted to stand to the important body in the bed, the higher you ranked, and everyone in the room knew exactly where they fell in that invisible ladder. For you, the one actually in the bed, this means your first waking sensation is not peace but performance. There is no stumbling to a kitchen half asleep, no quiet cup of anything, no blessed 10 minutes of being a dishevelled human before the day begins. You're on display from the instant your eyes open. Every yawn is witnessed, every stretch is noted. If your face looks tired, someone will remark on it later gently and it will travel. You learn very quickly to wake up already composed, which is a skill no person should have to develop. So there you are, wealthy beyond most people's dreams, shivering under priceless silk, greeting the dawn in front of a small polite audience who consider this the highlight of their morning. It is opulent, it is absurd, and it is only the beginning, because now that you are awake, you cannot simply get dressed. Oh no! Getting dressed, as you are about to discover, is an entire ceremony of its own. Now that you are upright and surrounded by an audience, it is time for the lever, the formal ritual of getting dressed, which was somehow both a chore and a religious experience. You do not put on your own clothes. Absolutely not. That would be far too simple and far too dignified. Instead, each garment is handed to you by a specific person, in a specific order, according to a ranking so strict it could start a small war. The highest ranking noble present has the honour of passing you your shirt, and if someone of even greater rank happens to arrive halfway through, the shirt must be taken back and handed over again by the more important person, while you stand there, half-dressed and shivering, like a very expensive mannequin. What should take 4 minutes takes closer to an hour. By the time you're finally clothed, you've been touched, adjusted, powdered, and stared at by more people than most peasants meet in a year. And you still have not had breakfast. Let's appreciate the sheer machinery of this. There is an order to everything, and the order is the entire point. One person is responsible for the stockings. Another handles a particular garment and nothing else. The passing of each item up the chain to the hands worthy of presenting it to you is choreographed like a slow, solemn dance, and heaven help anyone who reaches for the wrong thing at the wrong moment. To hand you your shirt out of turn was not a small mistake. It was a violation of the natural order, a tiny act of treason against the hierarchy, and it would be discussed. You, meanwhile, are simply cold. You're standing in a chilly room while grown adults negotiate silently over who is important enough to help you into your sleeves. Picture waiting to put on a coat while 2 people argue, entirely through eyebrows, about which of them has earned the privilege of holding it for you. That is your morning, every morning. Your job in all of this is to remain gracious and still, to lift an arm when required, to tilt your head when powder is applied, and above all to behave as though being dressed by committee is the most natural thing in the world. There is a reason for the madness, of course. This whole elaborate business tied everyone at court tightly to the person at its centre. If the only way to gain influence was to be physically present at these intimate rituals, then everyone who mattered would fight to be there, and a ruler surrounded by rivals could keep them all close, all watching, all competing for the honour of handling a stocking. It was control disguised as flattery, a leash braided out of privilege. The people jostling to hand you a garment were not really there for you. They were there to be seen being close to you. And so your first productive hour of the day is spent being slowly assembled like a fine piece of furniture in front of a crowd, in the cold, according to rules older than you are. You're magnificent by the end of it, perfectly turned out, every layer in place. You're also faintly exhausted, and the sun has barely risen. But before you can even think about the day ahead, your body reminds you of a far more urgent and far less glamorous need, and satisfying it in this palace of gold is going to be its own humbling adventure. Let's talk about the bathroom situation, because being rich did not save you from one of humanity's oldest problems, it simply added marble to it. For all its mirrors and gold, the Palace of Versailles was famously short on anything resembling a proper toilet. So you, a person of enormous wealth, relieve yourself into a chamber pot, an ornate porcelain bowl that someone else has the deeply unfortunate job of carrying away. If you're out and about in the palace and the need strikes, well, the corners of hallways, the bottoms of grand staircases, and the quiet spaces behind heavy curtains all saw a great deal of traffic they were never designed for. Courtiers in silk gowns worth a fortune would slip away to a stairwell and do exactly what you think. The result was a building that gleamed in every painting and quietly reeked in every reality. Money bought you many things in 1780s France. A pleasant place to go to the bathroom was somehow not one of them. Consider the logistics you're working with. A palace crowded with hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, all of them eating rich food and drinking wine, and nowhere near enough proper facilities to accommodate the results. Chamber pots were the standard, tucked discreetly into rooms and behind screens, emptied by servants whose entire day involved carrying away other people's business without visibly reacting to it. Spare a thought for those servants, honestly. Somewhere in that shining palace, a real human being was walking a covered bowl down a corridor and hoping not to trip. The truly fashionable had access to a slightly grander solution, a padded seat concealing a pot, an elegant piece of furniture that dressed up the whole affair in comfort and pretended it was something else. But there were never enough, and demand, shall we say, was relentless. When you cannot reach one in time and dignity is competing with necessity, necessity has a way of winning. This is how a corridor in the most celebrated palace in Europe becomes a place you learn to watch your step. The gilded halls that dazzled visitors by day carried a distinctly different atmosphere in the neglected corners, and everyone simply agreed, collectively and silently, not to talk about it. Think about what this does to the grand illusion. From a distance, from a painting, from a careful description, this is the height of human refinement, a golden world of beauty and grace. Up close, it is a warm, crowded building with a sanitation problem it never fully solved, where a duchess might lift her enormous skirts in a stairwell and a marquis might duck behind a curtain, both of them worth more than a village, both of them dealing with the same ancient indignity as everyone who ever lived. Wealth changed the setting. It did not change the plumbing, so you handle your business as gracefully as the circumstances allow, which is not very, and you return to the shimmering performance of your day pretending the last few minutes did not happen. It is a useful skill, this pretending, and you will use it often. But now, surely, comes relief of a different kind. Surely all this wealth means you can at least wash yourself properly afterward, scrub away the morning, sink into some warm and fragrant water. Prepare to be disappointed because in 1780s, France, bathing was viewed as something close to a medical risk. Surely you think all this wealth at least meant regular baths, warm water, fragrant soaps, a long luxurious soak to wash away the morning. Sadly, no. In 1780s, France, even among the very rich, full immersion bathing was viewed with deep suspicion. Many believed that soaking in water opened the pores and let dangerous illnesses seep directly into the body, so the fashionable solution was to bathe as rarely as possible and pretend that was sophistication. Instead of washing, you performed what was politely called a dry toilette, wiping your face and hands with a cloth, changing your linen shirt and declaring the matter closed. A clean white shirt was considered proof of cleanliness all on its own, regardless of what was happening underneath it. So beneath the diamonds, the silk and the powder, you are, to put it gently, ripe. And everyone around you is exactly the same, which is the only reason nobody says anything. Let's sit with the logic here, because it is genuinely fascinating in its wrongness. The thinking went that water, especially warm water, softened and opened the skin, and that this left you vulnerable to whatever sickness happened to be drifting through the air. Since people had no understanding of germs, and since bad air was widely blamed for disease, the conclusion seemed almost reasonable at the time. Why would you soak yourself in a substance that pried open your body's defences? Far safer, they reasoned, to keep the skin sealed and dry and simply manage the surface. It is the kind of confident wrong answer that only a whole society, all agreeing at once, can produce. So cleanliness became a matter of linen rather than water. Your fine white shirt or shift, worn against the skin, was believed to absorb the body's sweat and impurities, drawing the dirt out of you like a sponge. Change your linen often, keep it bright and fresh, and you were, by the standards of the day, clean. The visible whiteness of your undergarments was your certificate of hygiene, which is why the wealthy owned so much of it and changed it so frequently. You could be years between proper washes and still consider yourself immaculate, provided your shirt was crisp. The trouble, as you can imagine, is that a linen shirt is not a shower. It manages the problem the way a paper towel manages a flood. Underneath the fresh, clean cloth, the actual body went on being an actual body, day after day, warm and busy and entirely unwashed. Layer that reality across an entire crowded court, seal it into rooms with poor ventilation, add heavy clothing that could not easily be laundered, and you begin to understand why the coming solution, drowning everything in perfume, was less a luxury and more a desperate necessity. And yet, in their own minds, these people were the pinnacle of refinement. They looked at cultures that bathed more often as strange, even unhealthy. They were certain, absolutely certain, that their approach was the sophisticated one. It is a humbling reminder that being wealthy, powerful, and utterly convinced of your own good taste is no guarantee whatsoever that you are correct, or, in this case, that you smell like anything a modern nose could tolerate. So you wipe your face, button yourself into a spotless fresh shirt, and stride off feeling clean and virtuous, carrying with you the accumulated reality of a body that has not met soap and water in a very long time. But you will not walk around announcing that. You will announce something else entirely, something floral and expensive and overwhelming, because the next great weapon in the aristocratic arsenal is perfume, and you are about to apply a truly heroic amount of it. Since actually washing was off the table, the wealthy of 1780s France reached for the next best thing, which was to drown the problem in scent. Perfume was not a finishing touch. It was a survival strategy. You douse yourself in it, your clothes in it, your gloves in it, your handkerchiefs in it, and quite possibly your furniture in it. Rose, orange blossom, jasmine, musk, and a heroic amount of anything strong enough to overpower a human body that has not seen soap in weeks. The court was so committed to perfume that certain years and scents became fashionable the way outfits do. The tragic flaw in this genius plan is that perfume does not remove an odour, it simply stands next to it and shouts. So the grand halls of the palace carried a truly unforgettable blend, expensive floral fragrance layered directly over unwashed nobility, all mingling in warm, poorly ventilated rooms. You're not clean, you're merely loud about it. Perfume in this world was serious business, and the money spent on it was staggering. Whole industries grew around supplying the court with scent, and the finest perfumers were treated as artists of real standing. Scented gloves were especially prized, worn as much for the fragrance they carried as for any practical purpose, so that every gesture of your hand released a little cloud of expensive flowers into the air. You perfumed your fans, your ribbons, your letters. You lived inside a personal weather system of manufactured aroma, and the richer you were, the more elaborate and exclusive your particular cloud. The strategy makes a certain grim sense. If you cannot eliminate the smell of hundreds of unwashed bodies in heavy clothing packed into warm rooms, your only real option is to launch a counterattack. And so everyone did, all at once, all with different scents, all as strongly as they could afford. Picture the result. You're not walking into a fresh garden. You're walking into a collision, a battlefield where rose is wrestling with musk, orange blossom is fighting jasmine, and underneath the entire chaotic bouquet sits the persistent, patient, unbothered reality that the perfume was trying to hide in the first place. The nose, mercifully, does eventually surrender. After long enough in that environment, you simply stop registering most of it, which is the only way anyone survived a crowded ballroom, and there was a cruel little trap built into all of it. Heavy perfume worn on unwashed skin and unwashed fabric for days does not stay pleasant. It ages, it sours, it tangles itself into the very odours it was meant to mask until the whole thing becomes something new and complicated and not entirely lovely. So the answer, naturally, was more perfume. Always more. You could never truly win, only keep reapplying, forever chasing the smell of flowers while the day wore on, and the rooms grew warmer and the crowds pressed closer. It is worth pausing on how confident everyone was that this counted as elegance. To be heavily perfumed was to be refined, desirable, fashionable. A person trailing a strong scent was making a statement about their wealth and their taste, and no one thought to question whether the entire enterprise was, at its heart, an enormous and expensive act of concealment. This was simply how a sophisticated person smelled, which is to say powerfully. So you finish your fragrant armour, wreathed in the most expensive flowers money can buy, ready to face the day smelling like a garden that is trying very hard. And now, with your skin sealed and scented, it is time to actually build your body into the shape society demands, starting with a garment that will teach you to breathe in small, careful, disciplined sips. Now, let's dress you properly, and if you are a woman of wealth, that begins with the stays, the stiff-laced garment we would recognize today as a corset. This is not a gentle shaping garment. This is architecture, reinforced with strips of whalebone and pulled tight by a servant bracing a knee against your back. The stays mould your torso into the fashionable rigid cone, flatten your stomach, and lift everything upward into the correct silhouette. Comfort is not the goal. Posture and status are the goal. You will sit upright because you physically cannot slouch. You will eat lightly because there is nowhere for the food to go. And on a warm day, in a crowded room, laced within an inch of your life, the occasional graceful feint was so common that fashionable ladies carried little bottles of smelling salts for exactly that reason. You wanted to look effortless. You would achieve it while quietly gasping. Let's talk about what these stays were actually made of, because the engineering is half the story. The stiffening came most often from baleen, the tough, flexible material taken from whales, cut into thin strips and sewn into channels throughout the garment. This gave the stays their firmness and their shape, turning a piece of fabric into something closer to a wearable frame. Lacing ran up the back, and tightening it was a two-person job, one of you holding still and enduring, the other pulling steadily and with real effort. It is difficult to overstate how much of your daily silhouette was not you at all, but a carefully constructed cage doing the work your muscles were forbidden to do. there is an argument, and it is a fair one, that stays were not pure torture. Worn correctly, they supported the back, distributed the considerable weight of heavy gowns, and were simply the ordinary underpinning of respectable dress, no stranger to the women of the time than any everyday garment is to us. Not every set of stays was cinched to a punishing extreme. For many women, they were just the normal, expected foundation you put on without much thought. But for high fashion, for the court, for the occasions that demanded the most dramatic shape, the lacing tightened and the comfort vanished, and that is the version you, our fashionable noble, are wearing today. And that version has consequences. Bound tightly at the ribs and waist, your breathing becomes shallow by necessity, your lungs given far less room than they would like. Bend at the waist? Not easily and not gracefully. Slouch after a long evening? Impossible, which is precisely the point, because a straight back was the mark of good breeding, and the stays enforced it whether you cooperated or not. Eat a large meal inside this construction, and you will regret it quickly, since your stomach has been given a firm and non-negotiable ceiling. Small portions were not always daintiness. Sometimes they were simple mechanics. The fainting, then, was not mere delicacy or drama, though it certainly became fashionable to be seen as fragile. Combine restricted breathing with a hot, crowded room, layers of heavy fabric and a long event you cannot leave, and a swoon becomes a genuine physical event. Which is why the smelling salts existed, tucked away and ready. A small, sharp remedy for the predictable moment your body objected to what fashion was doing to it. So, you're laced, upright, and elegant, breathing in careful, measured sips. Your posture flawless because you have no other option. And now that your middle has been sculpted into the perfect shape, it is time to make you wider, dramatically and impractically wider, with a contraption that will turn every doorway you meet into a small logistical crisis. With the stays in place, it is time to widen you considerably. Enter the panniers, the framework of hoops worn on each hip that pushed your skirts out to the sides, sometimes to a truly heroic width. At their most extreme, a formal court gown could stretch several feet across, meaning you now occupy roughly the same floor space as a small dining table. This creates a delightful set of problems that no amount of money can solve. Doorways become a strategic challenge you must approach at an angle. Sitting down requires planning, and often a specially designed chair. Two fashionable women cannot pass each other in a narrow corridor without one of them essentially reversing out. Carriages become a puzzle of folding and stuffing. You glide through the palace looking magnificent and immovable, a walking monument to the idea that taking up space was itself a form of wealth. Let's understand the structure holding you out to such absurd dimensions. Panniers were frameworks, made of materials like cane, wood, or metal, tied around the waist and hanging at the hips to spread your skirt sideways while leaving the front and back relatively flat. For the grandest court occasions, they reach widths that seem almost comical now, forcing an entirely new way of moving through the world. This was not an accident or an oversight. The width was the message. It announced that you had the wealth to drape yards and yards of costly fabric across an enormous frame, and the leisure to move slowly and carefully through spaces that ordinary furniture and ordinary doorways were never built to accommodate. The practical comedy of daily life inside such a garment is hard to overstate. Doorways, as mentioned, demanded a careful sideways approach, a little turn and shuffle that everyone performed and no one acknowledged. Sitting was its own science. You could not simply drop into a chair, so seating was chosen and arranged with the panniers in mind, and lowering yourself gracefully was a maneuver you practiced until it looked natural. A crowded room became an obstacle course of gently colliding skirts, each woman navigating a sea of hoops, all of them maintaining perfectly serene expressions as though gliding a small tent across a ballroom were the easiest thing in the world. And then there were carriages, those beautiful cramped boxes that had absolutely not been designed for a person the width of a doorway. Getting in was an exercise in strategy and compression, folding the frame, angling the body, tolerating the crush, and hoping the whole architecture survived the journey. Arriving somewhere often meant reassembling your composure and your silhouette before you could be seen. The gap between how effortless you were supposed to appear and how much quiet effort it actually required was, as always in this world, enormous. Yet think about what the panniers accomplished as a symbol, because that was their true function. In a society obsessed with rank and display, physically occupying more space than the people around you was a way of announcing your importance without saying a word. The sheer impracticality was the luxury. A working person could not possibly move through their day dressed like this. Only someone freed from all useful labour, waited on at every turn and financed by great wealth, could afford to be this beautifully, uselessly enormous. Your discomfort was a boast, so you sweep through your golden world at your grand new width, turning sideways at doors, planning your every seat, a magnificent inconvenience to yourself and everyone near you. And now, having conquered your torso and your hips, fashion looks upward with fresh ambition, because the last thing left to exaggerate is the one part of you still a reasonable size, namely your head. Let's move upward to the crowning glory of 1780s fashion, the towering hairstyle known as the pouf. This was not a haircut. This was an event. Hair was teased, padded over wire and wool cushions, and built upward into a soaring monument that could rise a foot or more above your scalp. And it did not stop at height. These creations were decorated with ribbons, feathers, flowers, jewels, and in the most competitive cases, entire miniature scenes, ships, gardens, whatever proved you were more fashionable than the woman across the room. Building one took hours and the steady hands of a skilled hairdresser who was treated something like a modern celebrity stylist. The catch, of course, is that a structure this elaborate cannot simply be redone every morning, so it stayed, for days, sometimes weeks. You slept sitting up to preserve it, balanced your head with the care of someone carrying a wedding cake, and prayed the whole thing survived the next low doorway. Let's begin with the construction, because a pouf was genuinely an act of engineering. The hairdresser would build the shape around a foundation, padding and supports over which your own hair, and often added hair, was arranged, powdered, and set into place. Height was everything, and the fashionable competed to see who could raise their tower highest and adorn it most cleverly. The most celebrated hairdressers of the day became famous, sought after, and expensive. Their skills discussed the way we might discuss a great artist. To have your hair done by the right person was a status symbol layered on top of a status symbol. And these were not simply tall, they were themed. A pouf might commemorate an event, tell a little story, or make a fashionable reference decorated with objects and ornaments that turned your head into a small stage. There is a famous tale of a hairstyle built to celebrate a naval victory, complete with a model ship riding the waves of the hair. Whether every such story is exact or a little embellished, the spirit is entirely true. The pouf was a canvas, and the wealthy competed to be the most inventive, the most talked about, the most impossible to ignore across a crowded room. The problem, and there is always a problem in this world, is time. You cannot dismantle and rebuild a structure like this every single day. It takes too long and costs too much. So it stayed up, sometimes for a week or more, which turned your own head into a delicate monument you had to protect around the clock. Sleep became a careful negotiation, often propped upright or cradled just so, all to keep the architecture from collapsing overnight. Movement slowed. You held your head level and steady, mindful of every doorway, every carriage roof, every low chandelier that now posed a genuine threat to your masterpiece. Picture the sheer daily awareness required. You cannot lean back casually. You cannot dash through a doorway without thought. You cannot flop into bed after a long night. Every ordinary motion is filtered through the question of whether it endangers the tower on your head. You are, in a very real sense, a servant to your own hairstyle, organising your life around its survival. And you do it gladly, because to appear without a proper poof, or with a collapsed and sagging one, would be a small social catastrophe. So you carry your soaring, jewelled, days-old monument through the palace, with the poise of someone balancing something priceless, which you are. It is beautiful, it is ridiculous, and it is about to reveal a hidden cost because a warm, greased, unwashed tower of hair, left standing for a week or more, tends to attract company. Very small, very unwelcome company. Now, about those hairstyles that stayed up for weeks, let's gently address what tends to happen to a warm, greased, powdered, unwashed tower of hair left standing for days on end. The poof was held together with generous amounts of pomade, a thick pomade often made from animal fat, which was excellent for structure and, unfortunately, absolutely irresistible to insects. Combine grease, powder, warmth, and time, and you've created not a hairstyle but a small habitat. Lice were a constant, uninvited companion, which is precisely why so many wealthy people carried long, slender scratching sticks, elegant little tools designed to reach up into the architecture and relieve the itching without collapsing the entire creation. Stop and picture that. You are dripping in jewels, gliding across a ballroom, the very image of refinement, discreetly poking a stick into your own hair to deal with the tenants. Being rich in old France was frequently just being uncomfortable in more expensive ways. Let's understand why the pomade was such a problem. To build and hold those towering shapes, you needed something thick and heavy to grip the hair and keep the structure standing, and fat-based pomades did the job beautifully. But fat is fat, and warmth is warmth. And over days, a greased, powdered, undisturbed head becomes a genuinely inviting environment for the sorts of small creatures that have followed humans around forever. The very thing that made the hairstyle possible also made it a residence. You could not have the height without the grease, and you could not have the grease over time without the guests. This is why the scratching stick, sometimes an elegant little rod of ivory or another fine material, was such a useful accessory. An itch was inevitable, and you could hardly reach up with your fingers and start rummaging around inside a jewelled monument that took hours to build. So the delicate tool was slid discreetly into the structure to relieve the maddening tickle without disturbing the shape. It is one of the most quietly telling objects of the era, a beautiful instrument whose sole purpose was to help you scratch at the wildlife nesting in your fashionable hair while maintaining an air of total serenity. And here is the part worth holding on to. This was not a problem of the poor. We tend to imagine lice and grime as afflictions of the desperate, the ragged, the people scraping by. But the poof was a luxury of the wealthy, the most expensive and elaborate hair in the country, and it came with exactly these companions built in. The higher your station, the taller your hair, the longer it stayed up, and the more hospitable it became. In a strange way, the fanciest heads in France were often the most inhabited. Refinement and infestation, hand in hand, gliding together across the ballroom floor. Consider the mental discipline this demanded. To itch, sometimes fiercely, and to reveal nothing. To carry on a witty conversation, to dance, to hold court, all while quietly aware of the small, unpleasant reality perched on top of your skull. Composure was everything, and composure meant never letting the discomfort show, never breaking the illusion, never admitting out loud what everyone in the room already knew was true of their own heads as well. The whole court was in on the secret, and the whole court pretended otherwise, so you glide onward, jewelled and serene and faintly itchy, master of a hairstyle that is slowly becoming an ecosystem. And once the hair is settled, attention turns to the face, where fashion demands a flawless, luminous, deathly pale complexion, achieved with a cosmetic that was as poisonous as it was popular. Let's talk about your complexion, because the beauty standard of the era was pale, and I mean unnaturally, ghostly, almost luminous pale. Tanned skin meant you worked outdoors like a common labourer, so the fashionable rich went to alarming lengths to look as though they had never once seen the sun. The most popular way to achieve this flawless white finish was a cosmetic made with white lead, spread thickly across the face, neck, and chest. It gave that smooth porcelain look everyone wanted. It also happened to be slowly poisonous. Over time, lead-based makeup damaged the skin it was meant to beautify, which meant you applied even more to cover the damage, which caused more damage. A truly vicious and expensive cycle. Add a bright circle of rouge high on each cheek, applied with more enthusiasm than subtlety, and your fashionable face was complete. You looked exactly as society demanded. You were also, quite literally, wearing a low dose of your own decline. Let's understand the beauty logic first, because it explains the whole grim ritual. Pale skin meant you did not labour in fields under the sun. It meant leisure, wealth, and status, an entire life story told by a complexion. So the fashionable chased whiteness relentlessly, and the most effective way to achieve that perfect even porcelain surface was a preparation built around white lead, which blended smoothly, covered flaws, and delivered exactly the luminous finish everyone craved. It worked wonderfully as a cosmetic. It was also, we now understand, steadily harming the person wearing it. The cruelty of the cycle is what makes it so memorable. Lead-based makeup, worn regularly, took a toll on the very skin it was meant to perfect, leaving damage and discoloration behind. And what do you do when your skin looks worse? You cover it, with more of the same makeup, which does more harm, which you then cover with still more. Round and round it goes, the remedy feeding the disease, the mask growing heavier as the face beneath it grew worse. People spent fortunes making themselves beautiful in a way that quietly undid them, entirely convinced they were doing exactly the right thing. Onto that pale canvas went the rouge, and the French court wore it boldly. This was not the soft, natural flush a modern eye might expect. Fashionable rouge at the height of court style was applied in strong, deliberate circles high on the cheeks, a striking and highly artificial look that announced itself from across the room. Far from trying to seem natural, it embraced the artifice completely. The point was not to look like a healthy, outdoorsy glow. The point was to look expensively, unmistakably, fashionably painted, a face that could only belong to someone with the wealth and standing to wear it. And this was not only a feminine ritual. Men of the court painted as well, powdering pale and adding colour, all in the same pursuit of the refined, cultivated, untouched by labour appearance that mark the elite. The whole upper world of France went about with faces built up in layers of powder and paint, pale as the moon, cheeks bright, entirely committed to a standard of beauty that was as artificial as it was admired and as dangerous as it was expensive. So there you sit, your face a masterpiece of fashionable illusion, luminous and bright and quietly toxic, gazing at your reflection with satisfaction while the makeup slowly does its work beneath the surface. You look perfect. You look exactly like everyone who matters. and to complete the look, you reach for one final touch, a scattering of small dark shapes that were part decoration, part disguise, and part a secret language spoken entirely in little velvet dots. To finish the look, you reach for your beauty patches, the small dark shapes of silk or velvet that you stick onto your painted face. Officially, they were the height of elegance. Unofficially, they were doing double duty, because a well-placed patch was also a wonderful way to hide a blemish, a scar, or the little marks that lead-based makeup and disease like to leave behind. But here is the charming part. Where you placed the patch supposedly meant something. A patch near the mouth suggested one thing, near the eye another, on the cheek yet another. An entire silent vocabulary of flirtation and mood, written across your face in little velvet dots. Whether everyone truly agreed on this code is doubtful, but that hardly mattered. The point was to look mysterious, playful, and impossibly refined. So you dot your face with tiny black shapes, half fashion statement and half tactical cover-up, and step out to be admired for a beauty that was, underneath it all, held together with paste and secrets. Let's start with the practical purpose, because it explains so much about why patches caught on. A face built up in layers of lead-based paint did not stay perfect for long. The skin beneath suffered, blemishes appeared, and the elegant complexion everyone chased was often quietly falling apart under the powder. A small dark patch, placed with a bit of thought, could hide a mark, draw the eye away from a flaw, or simply add a spot of striking contrast against all that ghostly white. It was a cosmetic fix disguised as a fashion choice, which is possibly the most honest thing about the entire look. But of course the fashionable could never leave a good thing simple, so the patches were given meanings. The idea went that the placement of your patch sent a message to those clever enough to read it. One spot near the corner of the eye carried a certain flirtatious suggestion. One near the lips implied something else entirely. A patch on the forehead, on the cheek, beside a dimple. Each position supposedly whispered a little something about your mood or your intentions. It turned your face into a tiny coded letter that you rewrote every morning, a wordless flirtation for anyone paying close enough attention. Now, whether the whole court genuinely shared one agreed-upon dictionary of patch meanings is very much open to doubt. It is the kind of charming custom that grows in the retelling, half real fashion and half delightful legend. But the truth of it matters less than the spirit. In a world where so much was said through hints, glances and careful appearances, the notion that even the placement of a velvet dot could carry meaning fit perfectly. Everything at court was a language. Everything was a signal. Why should your beauty spots be any different? There is something quietly revealing in all of it. Your gorgeous, fashionable, luminous face was, when you look closely, a construction of paint over damaged skin, dotted with little patches placed to hide the wear and hint at your charms. The whole thing was beautiful precisely because it was so thoroughly built, layer upon layer, artifice upon artifice, until the actual person underneath nearly disappeared beneath the performance. And everyone agreed to admire the performance and never mention the rest. So you press your final velvet dot into place, your masterpiece complete, ready to speak volumes without saying a word. Your face is finished. Now, unfortunately, you have to open your mouth, and when you do, the state of your fashionable teeth is going to tell a rather different story about the price of being rich. Here's a strange upside of poverty in 1780s France. If you were poor, you probably kept more of your teeth. Sugar had become a glamorous status symbol among the wealthy, imported at great expense, and sprinkled into everything from delicate pastries to fashionable hot drinks. The more sugar you could afford to consume, the richer you clearly were, and so the elite happily rotted their teeth as a sign of prestige. There was no toothbrush culture as we know it, no dentist in the modern sense, and the treatments that did exist ranged from useless to genuinely alarming. Aching teeth were pulled by someone whose main qualification was a strong grip and a lack of squeamishness, with nothing to dull the pain but a firm chair and a bit of prayer. So your fashionable smile, funded by all that expensive sweetness, was often a gappy, aching, discoloured affair. In the strange math of the era, your suffering mouth was proof you had made it. Let's follow the sugar, because it explains the whole sad situation. For a long time, sugar was a rare and costly luxury, something only the wealthy could enjoy freely, and freely they did. It sweetened their drinks, filled their pastries, and appeared on their tables in elaborate confections designed to show off exactly how much of the expensive stuff a host could afford to waste. Consuming sugar was a way of displaying wealth, and the rich threw themselves into that display with real enthusiasm day after day, sweet after sweet. The trouble is that teeth do not care about status. Bathed constantly in sugar with no proper cleaning routine to speak of, the fashionable mouth decayed steadily and predictably. Cavities set in, teeth blackened, and the very people with the finest clothes and grandest homes often had the worst smiles in the country. It was an odd inversion. The labouring poor, unable to afford much sugar and living on plainer, coarser food, frequently held onto their teeth far longer than the sweet-loving elite who could afford anything they liked. And when a tooth went bad, the options were grim. Care of the mouth was primitive, and the removal of a troublesome tooth was a brutal, painful affair carried out without anything resembling modern relief from the agony. You gripped the chair, someone gripped the tooth, and the rest was endurance. A wealthy person might have access to slightly better practitioners than a poor one, but better is a generous word here. The fundamental experience was the same, namely pain, force, and hope. There were attempts at solutions, of course, some of them quite inventive and some frankly disturbing. The wealthy could pursue replacement teeth and various devices meant to restore a ruined smile, and a whole small trade grew around supplying the well-off with ways to look less toothless than they were. The results were mixed at best and often uncomfortable, but appearances had to be maintained, and a person of standing could not simply go about with an obviously wrecked mouth if any remedy could be bought. So picture the full effect. A magnificent noble, gowned and jewelled and painted to perfection, opens their mouth to laugh at a witty remark and reveals the true cost of all that fashionable sweetness. It is the era in miniature, beauty and decay side by side, the glittering surface and the rot beneath, all funded by the same wealth. Your smile is a receipt for your privilege. And speaking of all that expensive food, let's finally sit you down to eat. Because the aristocratic diet was a marvel of abundance that treated a meal less as nourishment, and more as a monument to having far more than you could ever actually need. Let's finally feed you, because you have earned it after that grueling morning of standing still while others dressed you. Breakfast for the wealthy was a rich affair, and it set the tone for a day of eating that would horrify a modern physician. Fresh bread, butter, preserves, delicate pastries, chocolate whisked into a warm, frothy drink, and coffee for those keeping up with the newest fashionable habit. It sounds delightful, and honestly, it partly was. But this was only the opening act of a diet built almost entirely around abundance for its own sake. You will spend your day surrounded by heavy, buttery, meat-laden, sauce-drenched food, not because you are hungry, but because having enough to waste was the entire point. Meanwhile, you barely move, cushioned by servants who do everything for you. A body fed like a king and work like a house cat can only go in one direction, and we will get there. For now, enjoy your chocolate, Let's dwell on that chocolate because it captures the spirit of aristocratic dining perfectly. Drinking chocolate had become a fashionable indulgence among the wealthy, prepared warm and rich and often taken in the comfort of one's own rooms as a leisurely start to the day. It was expensive, it was exotic, and it was exactly the sort of pleasant luxury that separated your morning from the morning of a working person who was already hours into hard labour while you sipped something warm and sweet in bed. Coffee, too, was rising in fashion, a newer habit for those keeping pace with the latest tastes. But breakfast was gentle compared to what followed. The great meals of the wealthy were extravagant productions, built around abundance, variety, and the display of plenty. Rich meats, elaborate sauces heavy with butter and cream, all manner of dishes arranged to impress as much as to feed. The goal of a grand table was never simply to satisfy hunger. It was to demonstrate that the host commanded such resources that food could be presented in staggering quantity and variety, far more than anyone present could reasonably eat. Waste in this world was a boast. The flavours leaned rich and heavy, the portions generous, and the emphasis fell squarely on the kinds of foods that announced wealth. Meat in abundance, refined breads and pastries, sweets and delicacies, all the things that cost money and effort to produce. Simple, plain, wholesome eating was for people who had no choice. You had every choice, and you chose over and over the richest options on offer, because that was what your station demanded and your table was expected to provide. Now set that diet against your daily life, which involved remarkably little physical effort. You were dressed by others, carried by carriage, waited upon at every turn, and spared nearly all the labour and movement that filled an ordinary person's day. Your existence was one of leisure by design, and leisure was itself a marker of your status. But a body given very rich food in great quantity and asked to do almost nothing with it faces a predictable reckoning, and the wealthy of the era met that reckoning constantly. This is the quiet contradiction at the heart of aristocratic feasting. The very abundance that proved your importance also worked steadily against your health. One heavy meal at a time. You ate to display your wealth, and your wealth, expressed through all that food and all that idleness, slowly took its toll on the body enjoying it. So finish your fashionable breakfast and prepare for a day of eating as performance, because among the truly grand, even the act of dining could become a public spectacle, with an actual audience gathered simply to watch you lift a fork. Now let's discuss one of the strangest customs of the French court, the grand couvert, in which the royal family dined in front of an audience. Not a private family meal, a show. Members of the public, provided they were decently dressed, could file into the room and simply watch the king and queen eat their dinner, the way you might watch animals at a zoo, except the animals were wearing crowns and pretending not to notice. As a wealthy noble, you exist inside this world of performance dining, where meals are less about nourishment and more about ceremony, ritual, and being seen. Every gesture is observed. Every bite is a small statement. Conversation is careful. Posture is perfect. And the food, having travelled from distant kitchens through long cold corridors, frequently arrives lukewarm and slightly sad. You dine in gold and candlelight before a curious crowd, chewing gracefully, performing appetite. Eating in peace was, apparently, for people no one cared to watch. Let's picture the scene properly, because it is genuinely one of the more remarkable customs of the age. At the appointed hour, the royal family would take their meal in a setting arranged for viewing, and a crowd of onlookers would gather to observe. These were not close friends or family. They were courtiers, visitors, and members of the public deemed presentable enough to be admitted, standing at a respectful distance to witness the simple act of dining as though it were a great occasion, which, by the rules of this world, it was. For those at the very centre of it, the royals themselves, this meant eating, under the steady gaze of strangers, every mouthful a matter of public record. And the ceremony around such meals could be elaborate beyond reason, with dishes carried in long processions, tasted and handled and presented according to strict ritual, each serving passing through many hands before it reached the plate. By the time all that ceremony had run its course, the food had often travelled a great distance from wherever it was cooked, growing cooler with every step, so that the grandest table in the land was frequently served meals that were, in plain terms, no longer hot. As a wealthy noble, you live inside the logic of all this, even when you're not the one being watched over dinner. Meals in your world were occasions, structured and observed, where how you conducted yourself mattered as much as what you ate. Your posture, your manners, the grace of your gestures, the ease of your conversation, all of it was on display and all of it was judged. A meal was never merely a meal. It was another stage, another performance, another chance to demonstrate that you belonged among the refined. Think about how exhausting that is as a way to eat. There is no slouching over your plate, no eating too eagerly, no relaxing into the simple animal pleasure of a good meal when you're hungry. Everything is measured. Everything is seen. You perform enjoyment, perform restraint, perform effortless elegance, all while managing lukewarm food and a room full of eyes. The act of feeding yourself, one of the most basic things a living creature does, has been turned into theatre. And this was considered a privilege, a mark of the highest status to dine so publicly and so ceremoniously. To be watched while eating was to be important. To eat quietly and alone, unobserved and unremarked, was the lot of ordinary people who did not matter enough to draw a crowd. The very things we might prize, privacy and peace at the table, were signs of insignificance here. So you dine beautifully, publicly, and a little coldly, performing your appetite for whoever cares to watch. And after enough years of this rich, ceremonial, relentless feasting, your body prepares a review of its own, delivered in the form of a swollen, screaming toe. After weeks, months, and years of this endless rich feasting, your body decides to send you a formal complaint, and its name is gout. This spectacularly painful condition, in which the joints, most famously the big toe, swell into red-hot misery, was so associated with wealth that people practically wore it like a badge. It struck the well-fed and the well-wined, which in 1780s France meant the aristocracy, over and over again. A gout flare could leave a powerful, dignified nobleman weeping in his chair, unable to bear so much as a bedsheet touching his foot, felled not by any enemy but by his own dinner. The cures on offer were a colourful parade of the useless, from strange tonics to firm advice that you ignored immediately. So you limp elegantly through your golden life, occasionally bedridden by your own indulgence, comforted only by the knowledge that gout was considered a rich person's affliction. Congratulations, even your suffering was exclusive. Let's describe the pain, because understatement does it no justice. A gout attack tends to arrive suddenly, often in the night, seizing a joint, classically the base of the big toe, and turning it hot, swollen, and exquisitely tender. The affected area becomes so sensitive that the lightest touch, even the weight of a bedsheet, can feel unbearable. A person who spent their days commanding servants and gliding through grand halls could be reduced, in the space of a few hours, to a helpless figure clutching a foot and dreading the slightest movement. There is no dignity in it, no matter how noble the sufferer. And it was closely tied to exactly the lifestyle you have been living. Rich food and generous quantities of wine were understood, even at the time, to be connected to these attacks. which is precisely why gout earned its reputation as an affliction of the well-off. The people who could afford to feast were the people who suffered it most, so much so that it took on a strange air of prestige, a painful little confirmation that you dined and drank well enough to earn it. Only the wealthy could afford to hurt this particular way. The treatments, meanwhile, were a museum of hopeful nonsense. Sufferers tried all manner of remedies, tonics, and regimens, some merely useless and some actively unpleasant, chasing relief from a condition that medicine of the day did not truly understand. The one piece of advice that might have genuinely helped, namely to eat and drink more moderately, was also the advice most cheerfully ignored, because moderation ran directly against everything the aristocratic table stood for. You were not about to give up the very feasting that proved your status, simply because your foot objected to it. So gout became a recurring visitor, arriving to lay you low, departing to let you recover, and returning again whenever your habits invited it back, which was often. Between attacks you carried on exactly as before, feasting and drinking and living the life expected of you, until the next flare reminded you of the price. It was a cycle as predictable as it was painful, and you rode it around and around because the alternative, restraint, was simply not on the menu. There is a bleak little comedy in it all. Here is a person with every material advantage the world can offer, undone not by war or hardship or enemies, but by their own dinner and their own wine, weeping over a toe in a room full of gold. The suffering of the rich was in this case entirely self-inflicted and entirely fashionable, a badge of honour that also happened to be agony. So, you nurse your aching foot, wait for the flare to pass, and prepare to rejoin a world where an even greater burden awaits, the vast and merciless rule-book of court etiquette, which governed everything you did with the strictness of holy law. Let's talk about etiquette, because at the French court the rules were not merely strict, they were a full-time occupation. There was a correct way to enter a room, to leave a room, to bow, to curtsy, to knock on a door, which for certain doors meant scratching with a single fingernail rather than knocking at all. There was a rule for who could speak first, who could sit, who could remain covered, and who had to stand for hours with an aching back and a frozen smile. Break one of these invisible rules and you did not get arrested, you got something worse, the quiet, withering judgment of everyone who knew better than you. This entire dizzying system existed to keep rank crystal clear at every possible moment, a non-stop performance of exactly how important you were compared to everyone else in the room. It was exhausting, it was absurd, and it was deadly serious. One clumsy gesture could damage a reputation built over generations. Let's take that business of scratching at doors, because it is such a perfect little example. At court, certain doors were not to be knocked upon in the ordinary way. Instead, the polite method was to scratch softly with a fingernail, and people are said to have grown a nail long on one hand specifically for the purpose. Pause and consider that. A grown adult, a person of wealth and standing, cultivating a single long fingernail so as to properly request entry to a room. That is the level of refinement and the level of absurdity we're dealing with. Every ordinary act had its correct and incorrect form, and the correct form was frequently strange. The depth of the system is what made it so punishing. It was not enough to be generally polite. You had to know the precise expected behaviour for countless specific situations, and you had to perform them flawlessly and instinctively as though breathing them. When to bow, and how deeply. When to speak, and when silence was required, whether you might sit or must stand, whether you might keep your hat on or must remove it, who took precedence entering a doorway, and 1,000 other tiny rules that governed the flow of court life. Master them, and you move through this world with ease. Fumble them, and you announced yourself an outsider. And the punishment for error was not loud or dramatic, which somehow made it worse. No one hauled you away. Instead, you were simply noticed, quietly, and judged. A misstep marked you as ignorant, ill-bred, or careless, and that judgment travelled through the whispers and glances of the court until your standing suffered for it. In a place where reputation was everything, the silent verdict of your peers could do lasting damage. People could ruin you without ever raising their voices, simply by knowing that you did not know the rules. Underneath the endless formality lay a clear purpose. All of it existed to make rank visible and constant. Every rule about who went first, who sat, who spoke, who bowed to whom, reinforced the precise hierarchy of the court at every moment of every day. The etiquette was not decoration. It was the machinery by which everyone was reminded endlessly of exactly where they stood in relation to everyone else. To follow the rules was to accept your place in that order, and to enforce them on others was to defend your own. So you memorize, you practice, you perform, and you never let your guard down, because the moment you relax is the moment you slip. It is a full-time job in itself, this business of behaving correctly, layered on top of everything else your privileged life demands. And nowhere did the whole strange system reach a more gloriously ridiculous peak than in the fierce, bitter, deadly, serious question of who was allowed to sit down. Nowhere did court etiquette reach a more gloriously ridiculous peak than in the Great War over seating. Specifically, the tabouret, a simple padded stool, whose right to sit upon it in the presence of the Queen was one of the most fiercely guarded privileges in all of France. Only certain high-ranking women were permitted this honour. Everyone else stood, and this was not a minor detail, it was a matter of blood, lineage, and years of simmering resentment. Families feuded over stool rights. Careers rose and fell over who was allowed to sit and who was condemned to remain standing. Duchesses guarded the privilege jealously and watched with narrowed eyes for anyone who might claim it without proper standing. Try to explain this to a starving farmer outside the gates and watch their face. Inside the palace, though, the right to lower your own body onto a small piece of furniture was worth more than most people's entire fortune. Such were the priorities of the very rich. Let's make sure the absurdity lands, because it deserves to. We're talking about a stool, a small padded backless seat, entirely ordinary in itself, and yet the right to sit upon it in the royal presence was one of the most coveted marks of rank at the entire court. To be granted the privilege was to be recognised as belonging to the highest tier of the aristocracy. To be denied it, while others enjoyed it, was a public and lasting statement about your inferior place. A piece of furniture had become a throne of its own, in miniature, and everyone understood exactly what it meant. The intensity of feeling around this was real, and by any sane measure, wildly out of proportion. Great families cared deeply about whether their women held the right to the stool, and disputes over such privileges could stir genuine bitterness. To lose a claim that a rival family kept was a humiliation. To gain one your family had never held was a triumph worth celebrating. This was not idle vanity to the people involved. In a world where rank was everything and every mark of it was fought over, the tabouret was a battlefield like any other, only smaller and from the outside considerably sillier. And so at gatherings in the royal presence, the room divided itself along these invisible and jealously guarded lines. A privileged few settled onto their stools, secure in their standing, while everyone else remained on their feet, sometimes for very long stretches, their aching legs a constant physical reminder of where they fell short. The seated and the standing, sorted by blood and privilege, all of it playing out silently in the arrangement of a room. You could read the entire hierarchy of the court simply by noting who sat and who did not. Now step outside the palace walls for a moment and hold this up against the reality of the country. Beyond the gates, ordinary people worked hard, went hungry in lean years, and struggled with the genuine problems of survival. And inside, the most powerful and privileged people in the land poured real passion and real grievance into the question of who might rest their body on a small stool in front of the Queen. The gap between those two worlds is almost too vast to comprehend, and it is exactly the sort of gap that, given time, tends to become dangerous. But that reckoning is still to come, for now the court cares enormously about its stools, and you must care too, because to be indifferent to such things is to forfeit your place among people who consider them the very substance of importance. So you learn the rules of sitting and standing, and you take them as seriously as everyone else pretends to. And it may surprise you to learn that this exclusive, rank-obsessed palace was, at the same time, remarkably open to complete strangers, because the doors of Versailles stood open to the public in a way you would never expect. Here is something that surprises most people. Versailles, the beating heart of royal France, was remarkably open to the public, as long as you were dressed appropriately, and you could often rent the required accessories at the gate. You could wander in and stroll the grand halls, gawk at the paintings, and watch the royals go about their carefully staged lives, which means you, our wealthy noble, live and perform in what is essentially the world's most exclusive theme park, permanently surrounded by curious visitors, hopeful petitioners, gossiping courtiers, pickpockets and sightseers who came simply to say they had seen it. The crowds could be enormous, the halls packed, the air thick and warm with the breath and perfume and general unwashed reality of hundreds of bodies. Privacy, once again, is nowhere to be found. Your grand home is a stage, your daily life is the entertainment, and the audience never fully leaves. Being rich here did not mean being alone. It meant never being alone. Let's dwell on how genuinely strange this arrangement was. The palace was not sealed away behind guards who turned back all but the chosen few. Within certain limits, ordinary people could come and go, provided they met the standards of dress expected of anyone entering such a place. And in a delightful practical touch, if you arrived without the proper accessories, there were ways to obtain what you needed on the spot, so that a visitor could be made presentable enough to pass through the doors. The bar was about appearance, not birth. Look the part, and the most famous palace in Europe would let you wander in. For the royals and the resident nobility, this meant living their lives amid a steady flow of strangers. The grand ceremonies, the public meals, the daily rituals, all of it unfolded before an audience that was not limited to intimates. Curious visitors came to observe, to marvel, and to be able to say they had walked those halls and glimpsed the great figures of the age. The palace functioned partly as a stage on which the theatre of monarchy was performed for whoever cared to watch, and watch they did, in considerable numbers. The crowds brought all the consequences you would expect. Halls grew packed and stifling. The mingled smells of many bodies, heavy perfume, and poor ventilation filled the air. And among the genuine sightseers and hopeful petitioners moved less welcome guests as well. The opportunists and thieves who saw in a crowd of distracted, richly dressed people an obvious opportunity. A palace open to the public was a palace open to everything the public contained, the honest and the dishonest alike. For you, living inside all of this, the effect is a life almost entirely without solitude. There's no clear line where the public world ends and your private world begins. You're watched at your rising, watched at your meals, watched as you move through the halls, surrounded always by attendants, courtiers, and now strangers besides. The grandeur that defined your world came bundled with a near total loss of privacy, an existence lived permanently in view. You were important precisely because so many people were looking at you, and so you could never, ever stop being looked at. It reframes the whole idea of aristocratic luxury, does it not? We imagine the wealthy retreating into serene private splendour, but the reality was closer to living on a crowded, glamorous stage that never emptied. Your home welcomed the world, and the world came, and you performed for it whether you wished to or not. So you glide through your crowded palace, on display to nobles and strangers alike, and it is worth remembering, before we go further, that the men in this world were every bit as elaborately and impractically decked out as the women, because male fashion was no less a spectacle. Let's take a moment to be fair, because it would be easy to imagine that only the women suffered for fashion. Not so. A wealthy gentleman of 1780s France was every bit as elaborately, impractically decked out as any lady at court. Picture-embroidered silk coats stiff with gold thread, waistcoats bright as a peacock, breeches fitted snugly to the knee, delicate stockings, and shoes finished with buckles and heels because a proper aristocratic man did not clomp about flat-footed like a labourer. Lace spilled from your cuffs and throat. A sword hung at your side, less for fighting, and more as a statement that you were a gentleman entitled to wear one. And crowning it all, a powdered wig, or your own powdered hair, dusted white with starch that drifted onto your shoulders like a light, expensive snow. You are perfumed, painted, and possibly patched yourself. The pursuit of looking effortlessly superior tortured everyone equally, regardless of who they were. Let's admire the fabrics first, because the wealthy man's wardrobe was a riot of colour and ornament that would startle a modern eye. Silks in rich hues, coats and waistcoats embroidered with elaborate patterns, gold and silver thread catching the candlelight, buttons that were tiny works of art in their own right. Where later generations of men would retreat into sober dark suits, the aristocrat of this era dressed to dazzle, and a fine gentleman's coat could be as intricate, as costly, and as carefully considered as any gown. To be plainly dressed was to be nobody. To be splendid was to be somebody. The details ran all the way down to the feet, and the shoes deserved particular attention. A man of standing wore shoes with heels and fine buckles, deliberately raised above the flat, practical footwear of those who actually worked for a living. Heels on a gentleman were a mark of refinement and rank, a small elevation that literally lifted you above the common sort. Add fine stockings drawn up over the calf, and the leg itself became something to display, shaped and shown off as part of the complete fashionable figure. A well-turned leg was a genuine point of pride. The sword at your hip belongs to this same language of appearance. For most gentlemen of the court, it was worn far more as a badge of status than as a practical weapon expected to see use. To wear a sword marked you as a man of a certain rank, entitled by your standing to carry one, and it completed the picture of the noble gentleman as surely as the embroidered coat. It was, in its way, another accessory, another signal, another piece of the costume that announced who you were before you said a single word, and then the powder. A fashionable man wore his hair, or his wig, powdered pale, dusted with a fine starch-based powder that whitened it to the approved fashionable shade. This powder had a habit of drifting loose, settling onto the shoulders of your dark coat like a delicate snowfall, a small, ongoing maintenance problem that every powdered gentleman simply accepted. Between the powder, the possible touches of paint, and the general devotion to a cultivated appearance, the wealthy man invested nearly as much effort into his looks as any woman at court. The point of all this is simple. The tyranny of fashion, the pressure to appear refined, costly, and effortlessly superior fell on everyone in this world. Nobody escaped it by virtue of being a man. The gentleman suffered his own version of the same discomforts and demands, spent his own fortune on his own elaborate plumage, and performed his own daily ritual of construction. Everyone was in costume. Everyone was on stage. The whole glittering court was dressed for a performance that never ended. So you finish your splendid, impractical, expensive ensemble, a peacock among peacocks, and prepare to move through your day, surrounded as always by the small army of people whose entire lives were devoted to making your own run smoothly. Let's talk about the invisible engine that made this entire lifestyle possible, the servants, because there were a great many of them, and they were everywhere. A wealthy household could employ dozens upon dozens of people, from cooks and footmen to the intimate attendants who dressed you, arranged your hair, and handled the tasks too undignified to name. Great noble houses were small kingdoms of labour, humming quietly behind the gilded walls. For you, this meant that from the moment you woke to the moment you slept, another human being was nearly always within arm's reach, watching, waiting, listening. You were never truly by yourself. A whispered conversation could be overheard. A private moment was a performance for whichever attendant happened to be nearby. The very servants who made your comfortable life possible also made it a fishbowl. You had everything done for you, which sounds wonderful, until you realise you also had nowhere to hide, and no thought that stayed entirely your own. Let's grasp the scale of it, because the numbers were extraordinary. A great household did not employ a handful of helpers. It employed a small workforce, a whole hierarchy of servants with specialised roles and their own internal ranks and rivalries. There were those who prepared food and those who served it, those who managed the household and those who did the heavy labour, those who cared for the horses and carriages, and those whose entire duty was the personal care of the family, dressing them, tending their hair, attending them through the day. Running an aristocratic life at the expected standard required an army, and that army lived and worked all around you. This meant your life was one of constant attendance, which is a mixed blessing dressed up as pure luxury. Yes, you were spared nearly every practical task. You did not dress yourself, prepare your own food, clean your own rooms, or trouble yourself with the countless small labours that filled an ordinary person's day. Others did all of it, quietly and skillfully, so that your path through the world was smoothed at every step. In terms of physical ease, few people in history have been so thoroughly waited upon. But look closer at what that ease costs. To be constantly attended is to be constantly accompanied, and to be constantly accompanied is to never be alone. There was almost always someone present, someone within earshot, someone whose duties kept them near you through the most ordinary and the most private moments of your day. The servants were discreet, of course, trained to be as unobtrusive as possible, but they were still there, still human, still capable of seeing and hearing, and later of talking. And talk they could, which made this a matter of more than comfort. The people who attended you knew things. They saw you at your least guarded, overheard conversations not meant for them, and understood the private workings of the household in ways no outsider ever could. In a world that ran on gossip and reputation, that knowledge had weight. A careless word spoken in front of the wrong attendant might travel further than you intended. Privacy was not merely scarce. It was, in a real sense, impossible, because your life was lived in the constant company of others. So the grand paradox of your privileged existence comes into focus. You were surrounded by helpers precisely because you were important, and being surrounded meant you were never free. Every luxury of attendance was also a small loss of solitude, until the two became impossible to separate. You had everything, including at all times an audience, and of all the arrangements this crowded, watchful, performing world imposed on you, few shaped your life more completely than the one we turn to next, namely marriage, which among the wealthy had remarkably little to do with love and a great deal to do with strategy. Now let's discuss your love life, or more accurately, your merger. Among the wealthy of 1780s France, marriage was a strategic arrangement. negotiated by families with all the warmth of a business contract, because that is essentially what it was. You did not marry for love. You married for land, for titles, for alliances, for money, and to strengthen the family name across the generations. Brides and grooms were frequently paired off young, sometimes barely acquainted before the wedding, their feelings on the matter considered charmingly irrelevant. A good match could lift an entire family, a poor one could sink it. Once wed, the two of you were partners in the great project of maintaining status, whether or not you could stand the sight of each other. Romance, tenderness, genuine affection, these were pleasant surprises if they happened at all, and nobody expected them. You did not gain a soulmate. You gained a very expensive and permanent professional obligation. Let's understand how a marriage actually came together, because there was very little of the heart in it. Families negotiated matches with an eye fixed firmly on advantage. What lands would join together, what titles would be strengthened, what debts might be settled, what alliances secured, what standing improved. These were the questions that shaped a union among the wealthy, and they were weighed carefully, sometimes over long negotiations, by parents and relatives who treated the whole affair as the serious matter of family strategy it was. The two people to be married were, in a sense, the least consulted parties involved. Age and acquaintance mattered little against these calculations. It was entirely normal for a match to be arranged while the couple were still quite young, and for the bride and groom to know one another barely, if at all, before the wedding day. You might find yourself joined for life to a near stranger, chosen for you by others for reasons that had nothing to do with your own wishes. Your preferences were a minor consideration at best, easily overruled by the greater goal of the family's advancement. In this world, you were not merely a person seeking a partner, you were an asset to be placed wisely. Once the match was made and the vows exchanged, the marriage became a partnership in status rather than a romance. The two of you were now jointly responsible for upholding the family's position, producing heirs to carry the line forward, and presenting the correct image to the world. Whether affection existed between you was largely beside the point. What mattered was that the arrangement functioned, that appearances held, and that the great ongoing project of the family's standing continued smoothly with the two of you as its newest partners. This is not to say love never appeared. Sometimes it did, growing over the years or striking by lucky chance, a genuine bond forming inside an arrangement that never required one. But such affection was a happy accident, not the purpose of the union, and no one entered marriage expecting it. To marry for love was regarded as impractical, even foolish, a luxury the serious business of aristocratic life could not afford. Feelings were unreliable, land and titles were not, so you take your assigned partner, join two great families, and settle into a lifelong professional relationship dressed up as a marriage. It is stable, it is strategic, and it is often quite cold. Which raises an obvious question about where all the passion in this world actually went, and the answer is that it went elsewhere, quietly and expectedly, into the discreet and thoroughly tolerated world of affairs. Given that marriage was a cold arrangement, it will not shock you to learn where the actual passion went. Among the fashionable elite, discreet affairs were so common that they were less a scandal and more an expectation, an open secret woven into the fabric of court life. Taking a lover or several was widely tolerated so long as everyone maintained the proper appearances and nobody was tacky enough to cause a genuine spectacle. Mistresses could wield real influence, and a well-connected lover was sometimes a source of power in their own right. The whole delicate dance ran on subtlety, gossip, coded glances, and an unspoken agreement that everyone would politely look the other way, at least until it became useful not to. It sounds thrilling and glamorous, and occasionally it was. But it was also a minefield of jealousy, reputation, and shifting loyalties, where the wrong affair with the wrong person could quietly ruin you. Even your heart was a matter of strategy. Let's understand the unwritten rules, because there absolutely were rules. Affairs were tolerated, even expected, but only if conducted with the proper discretion. You did not flaunt them crudely or force others to confront them openly. The whole arrangement depended on a shared willingness to keep up appearances, to preserve the dignity of the marriage on the surface while pursuing your genuine attachments beneath it. Manage that balance gracefully and no one blinked. Fail to manage it, cause a vulgar scene or an undeniable public humiliation, and you broke the delicate agreement that made the whole system work. The influence such relationships could carry is easy to underestimate. A lover was not always merely a private indulgence. In a world where access, favour, and whispered words shaped the fortunes of the powerful, a well-placed attachment could become a genuine avenue of influence. Mistresses in particular could hold real sway, their closeness to important figures translating into a quiet power that others had to reckon with. To love, in this world, was rarely only to love. It was also so often to position yourself, and so the pursuit of passion became yet another strategic game, layered on top of all the others. Who was attached to whom, and what did it mean? Which alliances of the heart might shift the balance of favour? A liaison could raise you or expose you, strengthen your hand or hand your enemies a weapon. You navigated it all through the same currency that governed the rest of court life: subtlety, gossip, glances, and careful reputation, treating even your affections as pieces to be moved with care. The risks were as real as the rewards. Jealousy simmered constantly. Loyalties shifted. A relationship that flattered you one season might endanger you the next, and the wrong entanglement with the wrong person, or one that spilled messily into public view, could damage a standing built over years. What looked from a distance like glamour and intrigue was, up close, a demanding and often anxious business, requiring the same vigilance and cunning as everything else you did. There is something quietly sad underneath all the intrigue. In a world where marriage was a contract and genuine feeling had to be pursued in the shadows, even love became tangled up with calculation, rarely allowed to be simple or safe. The passion that the cold arrangement of marriage left unmet went looking for satisfaction elsewhere, and found it in a system just as strategic, just as watched, just as fraught with consequence as the rest of aristocratic life. So you play the delicate game of the heart alongside all the others, carefully, always aware of who is watching. And when you seek distraction from all this exhausting manoeuvring, you turn, as the court so often did, to the gaming table, where fortunes changed hands in a single evening, and the truly fashionable lost enormous sums without letting a flicker of concern cross their faces. Let's talk about how the rich passed their endless free time, because chief among the court's obsessions was gambling, and the stakes were genuinely staggering. Card games and games of chance were everywhere, and fortunes changed hands across a single evening as casually as if the money were made of paper. To hesitate, to fret over your losses, to reveal that you actually cared about the sums involved, that was the truly shameful thing. A proper aristocrat lost enormous amounts with a serene smile and reach for more, because appearing indifferent to money was itself a sign of having plenty of it. Except, of course, that many did not. Behind the calm faces and the elegant tables, real families were being quietly gambled into ruin, dignity intact, coffers empty. You're expected to play, expected to lose gracefully, and expected never to let the panic show. So you push another stack across the table, keep your expression pleasant, and feel your family's future slipping away one polite hand at a time. Let's picture the setting, because gambling was not some shameful vice hidden away in back rooms. It was a central, glittering feature of fashionable life, conducted openly at court and in the grand homes of the wealthy. Games of cards and chance filled the evenings, drawing the elite to their tables night after night, and enormous sums flowed across those tables with a casualness that would make a modern person dizzy. This was entertainment, socializing, and a display of status all at once, the place where the leisured rich spent their abundant free hours and frequently their abundant fortunes. The unwritten code governing how you played mattered enormously. The mark of true breeding was to gamble with an air of complete indifference to the outcome, to win without excitement and lose without dismay, to show that you cared about the money, to flinch at a heavy loss, or grasp too eagerly at a win, was to reveal that the sums actually mattered to you, which was to reveal that you were not so effortlessly wealthy as you wished to appear. Composure at the table was everything. You maintained a serene face while a small fortune vanished, because your calm was itself a statement of how much you could supposedly afford to lose. The trouble hiding beneath all that serene composure is that many players genuinely could not afford it. The pressure to play, to keep up, to lose gracefully among your peers drove people to wager sums that their real resources could not sustain. And so behind the pleasant expressions and the elegant candlelit tables, actual damage was being done. Real wealth bled away hand after hand, night after night. The performance of not caring masked families sliding toward genuine ruin, their fortunes drained by the very games meant to display their status. It is a cruel little trap when you lay it out plainly. You are expected to gamble, expected to stake large amounts, and expected above all to show no concern for the results, all in the name of appearing appropriately wealthy and refined. But that same performance could carry you steadily toward disaster, since the appearance of indifference to money was easiest to maintain right up until the money was actually gone. The pressure to seem rich helped make people poor, so you take your seat at the table, wear your pleasant, unbothered smile, and lose with all the grace society demands, whatever it may be costing you underneath. And this brings us to the larger and rather grim financial reality lurking behind so many of these glittering lives, because a shocking number of the very rich were, in truth, buried in debt. Now for the dirty secret hiding beneath all that glittering wealth. A shocking number of the very rich were drowning in debt, maintaining the required lifestyle, the clothes, the wigs, the servants, the carriages, the entertaining, the gambling, the constant need to appear at least as splendid as everyone around you cost breathtaking amounts of money, often far more than even great estates could actually produce. But you could not simply scale back, because to visibly economize was to admit weakness, and admitting weakness could collapse your standing entirely. So you borrowed, you bought on credit, you lived far beyond your means and prayed the whole delicate structure would hold. Whole noble families teetered on the edge of financial disaster while smiling through banquets they could not afford. Because keeping up appearances was not vanity, it was survival within their world. You were magnificent, envied, and possibly one bad harvest away from catastrophe. Being rich in 1780s, France was often just being expensively, elegantly broke. Let's tally up the expenses, because the sheer cost of the life was staggering. Everything about your existence was expensive by design. The wardrobes that had to keep pace with fashion, the hairdressers and the powder and the perfume, the small army of servants who needed to be paid and housed and fed, the carriages and horses, the entertaining, the gambling, the the endless obligations to appear generous and splendid before your peers. Each of these alone was a serious drain, and together they formed a mountain of ongoing cost that even substantial wealth struggled to meet. The grander your position, the more it demanded of you, and the demands never stopped. The obvious answer, spending less, was in practice almost forbidden. In a world where standing was everything, and everything was on display, to visibly cut back was to signal that your fortunes were failing, and such a signal could be disastrous. Rivals would notice, whispers would spread. Your place in the delicate hierarchy, so dependent on appearance, could begin to slip. And so, economizing openly was a kind of surrender that few were willing to risk because the appearance of wealth was itself a form of wealth, and losing it could bring down everything else. Trapped between crushing costs and the impossibility of visibly reducing them, the wealthy did what desperate people with good credit have always done. They borrowed. They bought on credit. They pushed the reckoning into the future and carried on maintaining the grand front, hoping that income, inheritance, or fortune would eventually close the gap. Behind the splendid facades of great houses lay financial arrangements far shakier than anyone would admit, structures held together by debt and by the shared agreement never to look too closely at the foundations. The result was a strange and precarious way to live, magnificent on the surface and fragile underneath. A family might host dazzling entertainments, wear the finest clothes, and command every outward sign of prosperity, while quietly balanced on the edge of serious trouble. The performance of wealth demanded real money that the performers increasingly did not have, and the whole system leaned on credit, hope, and appearances holding just a little longer. So you smile through the banquet you cannot truly afford, dressed in splendour bought partly on borrowed money, one of many who looked far richer than they were. It is a fittingly hollow luxury, all glitter and no ground beneath it. And when you seek relief from the exhausting business of maintaining all this, you might retreat to a very different arena, the salon, where the price of admission was not money at all but wit. Let's step into the salon, the elegant gathering where the fashionable and the clever met to talk, and where a whole different kind of wealth was on display. In these rooms, often hosted and skillfully steered by influential women, the currency was not gold but wit. Guests debated philosophy, art, science, and the daring new ideas rippling through the age, and your reputation could rise or crumble on the strength of a single well-timed remark. A dull comment marked you as tedious, a clumsy one marked you as a fool, but a sharp, graceful observation, delivered at exactly the right moment, could make your name overnight. This was intellectual combat dressed in silk, and it demanded that you be quick, informed, and effortlessly charming, all while never appearing to try. For a wealthy noble raised mostly to look decorative, the salon was a genuine test. Money got you through the door. Only your mind kept you welcome once you were inside. Let's appreciate what the salon actually was, because it was one of the more genuinely admirable institutions of the age. These were gatherings, held in private homes, where people came together to talk, to argue, to share ideas, and to enjoy the pleasures of clever company. Frequently they were organized and guided by accomplished women, who acted as hosts and, in effect, as the directors of the conversation, drawing out their guests, steering the discussion, and setting the tone. In an era that gave women few formal avenues to influence, the salon was a rare stage on which a brilliant hostess could wield real cultural power, and the finest of them were celebrated for it. The talk itself ranged widely and often boldly. Philosophy, literature, science, art, and the exciting new ideas circulating through the age all found their way into these rooms, discussed with an energy and openness that could be thrilling. This was a period alive with intellectual ferment, when daring notions about reason, society and the world were spreading among the educated, and the salon was one of the places where those ideas were examined, debated and passed along. To attend was to sit at the centre of the era's conversation with itself. For you, all of this presented a very particular kind of challenge. In the salon, your rank and your fortune counted for less than your ability to hold your own in clever, informed, graceful conversation. You had to know something. You had to be quick enough to keep pace, sharp enough to contribute, and charming enough to do it all without seeming to strain. A well-made remark could win you admiration and a growing reputation as a person of genuine substance. A poor showing, dull, ignorant or clumsy, could mark you just as clearly as someone who did not truly belong among the brilliant. And you had to make it look effortless, which was its own demand. The prized quality was a kind of easy, natural brilliance, wit that seemed to arise without labour, learning worn lightly rather than paraded. To try too obviously, to strain for cleverness, or show off your knowledge too eagerly, was itself a failure of style. You were meant to sparkle as though sparkling were the most natural thing in the world, which of course required for most people a great deal of quiet preparation and considerable nerve. So the salon was a test that money alone could not pass. It rewarded the cultivated mind, the quick tongue, the genuine engagement with the ideas of the day, and it exposed those who had nothing to offer but their wealth and their title. For a noble accustomed to being valued simply for existing, it could be a humbling and demanding place, and a genuinely enlivening one. And yet, for all these glittering intellectual pleasures, aristocratic life carried a heavy and surprising burden beneath its surface. One we should be honest about, because the truth is that a great deal of the time, despite everything, you were profoundly bored. Here is a truth the paintings never quite capture. For all the glamour, aristocratic life could be crushingly soul-deadening boring. Your days follow the same rigid patterns, the same ceremonies, the same faces, the same carefully rehearsed conversations, over and over, in a world where genuine productive work was considered beneath you. There was opera, there was theatre, there were balls that ran until dawn, and yes, they could be dazzling, but there was also an enormous amount of simply waiting. Waiting for a ceremony to begin, waiting to be noticed, waiting for something, anything, to break the beautiful monotony. Whole afternoons dissolved into idle gossip, elaborate games, and the quiet, restless hum of people with everything money could buy and nothing meaningful to do with their time. The gilded cage was still a cage. You were pampered, adored, and richly entertained, and underneath it all, more often than anyone dared admit, you were profoundly, expensively bored. Let's confront the emptiness at the centre of it, because it is easy to miss beneath all the finery. Meaningful work, the kind that gives a person purpose and structure, and a sense of having done something, was regarded as beneath your station. You did not have a trade, a profession, or a task that genuinely needed doing. Your role was to exist splendidly, to occupy your place in the great hierarchy, to appear and to perform and to be seen. That may sound like a dream to anyone worn down by labour, but strip the labour entirely away and something else creeps in to fill the space, namely a vast and echoing idleness that had to be managed somehow. The days, for all their ceremony, could be numbingly repetitive. The same rituals unfolded in the same order, the same faces gathered in the same rooms, the same sorts of conversations circled the same subjects. Life at court followed rhythms so fixed and so familiar that the novelty wore thin and the sameness set in, a grand and gilded routine that repeated itself endlessly. Even splendour becomes ordinary when it is all you ever see, and the extraordinary experience daily curdles slowly into the mundane. There were amusements, of course, and some of them were genuinely magnificent. The opera and the theatre offered spectacle and artistry. Balls could be glittering affairs that ran deep into the night. There was music, there were games, there were entertainments arranged to fill the hours and dazzle the guests. But threaded all through this pursuit of diversion was a great deal of waiting, and a persistent low hum of restlessness, the sense of people casting about for something to do, something to feel, something to interrupt the pleasant sameness of it all. So the idle hours were filled however they could be. Gossip became a favourite occupation, the endless dissection of who was doing what with whom, a way of turning other people's lives into entertainment. Elaborate games and diversions passed the time. Intrigues and flirtations offered a bit of drama to relieve the tedium. Much of the frantic social manoeuvring of court life was, at bottom, a response to boredom, the activity of clever, energetic people with nothing productive to pour themselves into, generating their own entertainment out of one another. This is the quiet paradox of the gilded life. Freedom from all labour and access to every luxury did not add up to contentment. Instead, it often produced a peculiar restlessness, a hunger for stimulation, a sense of days that were comfortable and beautiful and strangely empty. The cage was made of gold, and it was still a cage, and the birds inside it, however finely fed, grew weary of their perch. And when the body inside that gilded cage finally faltered and fell ill, as every body eventually does, the wealth that could buy every comfort proved strangely powerless, because the medicine of the age was as likely to harm you as to heal you. Sooner or later, even the wealthiest body falls ill, and this is where your fortune truly fails to save you. Medicine. In 1780s, France was a confident blend of tradition, guesswork, and outright danger, and the rich received it in generous, enthusiastic doses. Fall sick, and your physician might reach first for bleeding, opening a vein to drain away what was believed to be excess or corrupted blood, weakening an already weakened patient. Purges and other violent remedies were popular, the general theory being that the body must be forcibly emptied of whatever was troubling it. Being able to afford the very best doctors sometimes simply meant receiving the most aggressive treatment, which was not always a blessing. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of germs, and no real safety net beneath any of it. So your wealth buys you an attentive, well-dressed physician with total confidence and dangerous methods, hovering at your bedside. Money could summon the finest medical care of the age. The age was the problem. Let's start with bleeding, because it was the great favourite of the era's medicine. The practice of drawing blood from a patient, opening a vein, or applying other methods to remove a quantity of blood was a standard response to a huge range of ailments. The reasoning went back to old ideas about balance within the body, the notion that illness arose from some disorder that bleeding could correct. So a sick person, already weakened, would be relieved of some of their blood in the sincere belief that this would help them recover. To a modern understanding, this often did precisely the opposite, taxing a body that needed all its strength, but the physicians of the day applied it with genuine confidence. Purging was the other pillar of treatment, and it followed the same logic. If illness came from something bad within the body, then forcing the body to expel it seemed sensible, and so remedies designed to violently empty the system were widely used. Between bleeding and purging, the standard medical approach to serious illness frequently amounted to depleting an already suffering patient, draining and emptying them in pursuit of a balance that these methods did nothing to restore. The treatments were vigorous, and vigour was mistaken for effectiveness. Here is the bitter irony for someone of your wealth. Being able to afford the most eminent physicians didn't necessarily protect you. In some ways, it exposed you further, because the finest and most confident doctors were also the most likely to intervene aggressively, to apply the fashionable treatments thoroughly, to do a great deal to you in the name of healing. The poor, unable to afford such attention, were sometimes spared the more damaging interventions simply by neglect. Your fortune bought you more medicine, and more medicine in that age was not always a mercy. And beneath all of it lay a fundamental ignorance that no amount of money could overcome. There was no understanding of germs, no knowledge of infection as we understand it, no antibiotics, no reliable way to fight the illnesses that regularly carried people off. The most learned physician in France, for all his confidence and standing, was working without the basic knowledge that makes modern medicine effective. He could attend you devotedly, apply every technique his training offered, and still be helpless against what a simple treatment would resolve today. So your wealth summons the best care the era can provide, delivered by an attentive and self-assured physician at your bedside, and that care is often the very thing that harms you. It is a humbling limit on the power of money, a reminder that some things could not be bought in 1780s France, because they had not yet been discovered by anyone at any price. And yet, for all these threats to your comfort and your health, the greatest danger to your privileged existence was none of these. It was subtler, more human, and closer at hand, because your entire glittering life rested on the fragile foundation of favour, and favour could vanish in an instant. Let's talk about the fragile thing your entire life quietly rested upon: favour. Your wealth, your influence, your very place at court depended on staying in good standing with the powerful, and that standing could evaporate with terrifying speed. A misjudged remark, a bad alliance, an enemy's clever whisper, a scandal that spread through the salons faster than any fire, and suddenly the doors that once opened for you were politely, permanently closed. To be exiled from court, sent away to moulder on some distant country estate far from power and attention, was a kind of social death that the ambitious feared far more than actual poverty. And so beneath every gracious smile ran a current of anxiety, the constant, exhausting awareness that everyone around you was watching, calculating, and quietly ranking their own advantage. Friendships were alliances, alliances shifted. Today's confidant could be tomorrow's downfall. You're surrounded by beautiful, charming people, and you can afford to fully trust almost none of them. Let's understand how much rested on favour, because it truly was the foundation of everything. Your standing at court, your access to the powerful, your ability to secure positions and advantages for yourself and your family, all of it flowed from being in good graces with those who mattered. This was not a minor social nicety. It was the very source of your influence, and often of your fortune, the invisible support beneath the visible splendour. And like anything built on the goodwill of others, it could be withdrawn, sometimes for reasons you barely understood. The threats to that standing were everywhere, and often impossible to guard against completely. A single, ill-judged comment could give offence. A poorly chosen alliance could tie you to the wrong faction just as it fell from favour. An enemy, and you would have enemies, could work quietly against you with well-placed whispers, and gossip could spread through the salons and corridors with astonishing speed, reshaping how you were seen before you even knew the story was circulating. Reputation was fragile, and there were always people ready to help it break. The consequence most feared was exile from the centre of things, being pushed out of the charmed circle and sent away from court to a life of obscurity on some remote estate. To the ambitious, this was a fate worse than many hardships. a removal from everything that gave life meaning in their world, namely proximity to power, the buzz of important company, the sense of being where things happened. To be sent away was to be forgotten, to watch your relevance drain away while others carried on without you. It was, in the terms that mattered to you, a kind of death. All of this bred a constant low-grade anxiety beneath the polished surface of court life. Everyone smiled, everyone charmed, everyone performed graciousness, and everyone was also watching, weighing, calculating their own advantage against yours. The pleasant faces around you belonged to people navigating the same treacherous currents, forming and breaking alliances as their interests shifted. A trusted friend might become a rival a threat, and loyalties could turn on the smallest change in the winds of favour. So you lived in a beautiful world full of charming people, and you learned to trust almost none of them completely. The warmth was often real enough on its surface, but beneath it ran the hard logic of ambition and survival, and you ignored that logic at your peril. Your glittering existence sat atop a foundation that could shift without warning, and staying upright required constant, wary attention. But even this anxious, watchful world, with all its private fears and shifting loyalties, was about to be dwarfed by something far larger, gathering slowly beyond the palace gates. Because while the wealthy fretted over favour and precedence, most of France was struggling with problems of an entirely different and far more serious kind. Now the tone of our story begins to change, because we must step outside the palace walls. Beyond the perfume and the gold and the endless ceremonies, most of France was struggling, and by the late 1780s, that struggle had sharpened into something much harder. Poor harvests had sent the price of bread, the food ordinary families depended on to survive, climbing to painful heights, while the burden of taxation fell heaviest on those least able to bear it. People went hungry, people grew tired, and they looked toward the shining excess of the aristocracy with a resentment that deepened by the season. To you, safe inside your golden world, this may have felt distant, a problem for other people in other places. But the gap between the dazzling few and the suffering, many had grown too vast to hold, and the quiet, weary anger of a whole nation was beginning to gather into something that could no longer be ignored or perfumed over, or waved away with a fashionable smile. Let's look honestly at what ordinary life had become for most people, because it stood in stark contrast to everything you knew. The great majority of the country lived far from the comforts of the court, and for many of them the late 1780s were genuinely hard years. Bread was the foundation of the common diet, the thing families relied on to survive, and when poor harvests drove its price upward, the effect on those living close to the edge was severe. Hunger was not an abstraction. It was a daily reality for people who could no longer afford enough of the most basic food to feed their families. The weight of taxation made the hardship sharper still, and its unfairness was keenly felt. The system placed much of its burden on those least able to carry it, while the privileged enjoyed exemptions and advantages that spared them the worst. Ordinary people laboured, paid and struggled, and watched a small elite live in extraordinary splendour, largely shielded from the costs that fell so heavily on everyone else. It was an arrangement that could only feel just so long as no one looked at it too closely, and more people were beginning to look. What grew from this was not only hardship but resentment, a deepening sense of grievance directed toward the visible excess of the wealthy. The contrast could hardly have been starker. On one side, families going hungry over the price of bread. On the other, a court spending fortunes on clothes, entertainments, and displays of abundance for their own sake. The people saw that contrast, understood it, and felt it as a wound, and the feeling hardened over time into something colder, and more determined than simple discontent. For you, secure within your golden world, all of this could seem remote, the concern of distant people whose lives barely touched your own. The walls of the palace, the rhythms of court life, the endless preoccupations of rank and favour, all of it worked to keep the wider world at a comfortable distance. It was easy to attend to your ceremonies and your intrigues and your entertainments, and to treat the troubles beyond the gates as background noise, someone else's problem, nothing that need disturb your day. But the gap between the few and the many had grown too wide to remain stable, and the accumulated anger of a struggling nation was not the kind of thing that could be soothed with fine words or waved away with an elegant gesture. Something was building slowly and steadily, out beyond the perfumed halls, a pressure that no amount of splendour could relieve, and no amount of indifference could dispel. The comfortable distance you had always relied upon was about to close, and when it closed, when the long-gathering storm finally broke, the world you knew would come apart, and the very things that had defined your privileged life would turn, with terrible speed, into the reasons it could not survive. And so we reach the end, and the real answer to tonight's question. When the storm finally broke in 1789, the world you knew came apart with astonishing speed. The revolution that followed swept away the old order, and the very things that had defined you, your title, your wealth, your name, your closeness to the crown, turned from sources of pride into sources of terrible danger. In the years that came after, being an aristocrat could be reason enough to lose everything, and in the darkest stretch of it, to lose your life. Many who had once glided through the palace of Versailles met their end at the guillotine, that grim machine that made no distinction between a king, a queen, and a fashionable noble who had done little more than be born into the wrong family at the wrong moment in history. This is why, in the end, you would not survive being rich in 1780s France. The gold, the silk, the powder, the endless, dazzling performance, all of it rested on a foundation that was quietly, steadily cracking beneath your beautifully shod feet. Let's trace how quickly the world could turn, because the speed of it is part of the lesson. For all its apparent permanence, the old order proved far more fragile than anyone inside it had imagined. The structures that had stood for generations, the hierarchy, the privileges, the unquestioned place of the aristocracy at the summit of society, gave way with a suddenness that must have been bewildering to those who had believed in their solidity. What had seemed eternal was revealed to be resting on foundations that could crumble, and when they went fast. The cruelest reversal was in what your advantages now meant. Everything that had once elevated you, your noble birth, your title, your wealth, your association with the crown and the court, became in the new world a mark against you. The very identity you had spent your life performing, refining, and defending was transformed into a source of danger. Privilege that had opened every door now closed them, and worse. To be recognised as an aristocrat in the hardest years that followed could place your life itself in jeopardy. The costume you had worn so proudly became something you might have given anything to shed, and in the darkest period of the revolution, that danger became mortal for many. The guillotine has come to stand as the grim symbol of those years, and it took the lives of people across the spectrum of the old order, from the highest figures in the land to nobles whose only real offence was the family into which they had been born. There was, in that terrible stretch, a levelling quality to it that made no distinction of the kind the old world had cared about so obsessively. Rank, which had governed everything, offered no protection at the end. Some fled abroad and survived in exile. Others did not escape in time. This is the honest answer to the question we began with. You would not survive being rich in 1780s France, not because wealth itself was fatal, but because the whole magnificent world it belonged to was built over a fault line that was slowly giving way. The splendour was real, and so was the fragility beneath it, and the two could not be separated. Every glittering privilege was also, in the end, a liability waiting for its moment. There is something worth sitting with in all of this, quietly, as the candles burn low. The people who lived those lives, in all their finery and folly and blindness, were human beings caught in a world they did not make and could not hold together, and the sweeping away of that world carried real suffering for people at every level of it. History is rarely as simple as villains and victims, and the fall of a gilded age is a heavy thing, however dazzling the age had been. So there you have it, a single life among the wealthy of 1780s France, from the freezing morning you woke to an audience, to the ceremony of being dressed by committee, to the perfume poured over a body that never met soap, the corset that taught you to breathe in careful sips, the towering hair with its unwelcome tenants, the poison you painted onto your face, and the dazzling, exhausting performance you kept up from dawn until the candles burned low. You feasted until your own foot rebelled, gambled away fortunes with a serene smile, married a stranger for the good of the family name, and lived every hour of it watched, judged, and never once truly alone. It was a world of astonishing beauty and astonishing folly, glittering on the surface and fragile underneath, and in the end it could not hold. The people who lived it were not so different from us. They wanted comfort and status and to be admired and to feel that their lives mattered, and they chased all of it as hard as anyone ever has. They simply chased it inside a gilded cage that was slowly giving way beneath them. So tonight, as you settle into your soft, clean bed, warm and washed and free to sleep as long as you like, with no ceremony to wake for and no audience to perform for, maybe spare a quiet thought for them. For all their silk and all their suffering, their towering wigs and their aching secrets, their splendour and their fear. Because history is often ridiculous, and often sad, and always, somehow, deeply human. And you right now are living a life more comfortable than any of them ever dreamed. Rest easy, sleep well, good night.